日本のファンにもよく知られている地元紙ロサンゼルスタイムズの名物コラムニストディラン・ヘルナンデス記者がドジャース専門番組ドジャーステリトリーに出演。番組ではマックス・マンシー選手、キケ・ヘルナンデス選手の契約&延長について自身の見解を語りました。さらに佐々木朗希投手に対し一部で見られる人間性への批判にヘルナンデス記者が反論する場面も。こうした見どころたっぷりの内容を日本語字幕付きでご紹介しますので、ぜひ最後までご覧ください。
We are pleased to be joined now by Dylan Hernandez, longtime sports columnist from the LA Times, who has just made the move over to the new California Post. Dylan, it is great to have you on. It's been a long time since I've gotten to see you, but I appreciate you taking the time on what is Cactus League Media Day. Clint and I were just talking about the Max Muncy extension and the interesting timing of it all. I'd like to get your take on the timing of it and why do this for Max and not do it for JT at the time?
I mean, honestly, probably Muncy's more productive right now than, Turner was at that point. I think, this gives them, right? I mean, the Dodgers love the word optionality. This kind of gives them optionality in a way. I mean, look, the reality is that this team is getting older, right? And I think, to be honest, had they not won the World Series, I probably would have been advocating in the Times to kind of blow the team up and maybe kind of start, by kind of injecting younger blood in here. What this kind of gives them the option to do, obviously, if Muncy's still, good at the end of this season, they can obviously bring him back. If it looks like, okay, maybe he's not quite the guy he used to be, and you have to reduce his role, or maybe even part ways with him. The salary's not big enough to where it's going to kill you by any means. So again, I think this just kind of presents the Dodgers with the option, and they. Like you were saying, kind of going into the break, obviously Muncy likes being in LA, and when you want to be in a certain place, you're willing to give up some money. And I think it just kind of got to a place, where the Dodgers thought it was workable.
The other news of the day, the other big news, the return of Kiké Hernandez, the worst kept secret in baseball. Bro was always going to be back. We were talking about it before you joined. I think eventually we're going to see that become official. Well, it became official, but you need a roster spot. Is it most likely going to be an Evan Phillips to the 60-day IL kind of situation?
That would be my guess. Obviously, I don't think that they, I know we kind of joke about all the roster moves they're doing and Rortvedt and his whole saga over the last few weeks. I don't think that they like doing it. I think they do it because they kind of have to. So yeah, I think if it's something like that, that's just kind of a simple transaction where they don't actually have to get rid of anybody. That's probably kind of the ideal thing. But you're right. This was kind of a, really kind of obvious kind of thing to do, especially after the World Series they had. They absolutely had to bring him back. I am kind of a believer in that, team wins a championship, you kind of owe it to the guys to, give them another run at it. And obviously he was a huge part of what happened. And, one of the great things, again, that the Dodgers kind of have going for them is they really don't have to be, really going until October. So, with all these guys, yes, it's kind of an older team and, they're coming off a short off season. And I think the way they're going to manage these guys throughout the spring even is probably going to be a little bit more gradual than it has been in the past. But, as long as, again, he's there in October, I think that's what they're looking for. Fans obviously are going to be happy with that too.
Dylan, one of the things I admire the most about you is your ability to speak 3 languages fluently, obviously English, Spanish, and Japanese. I mean, you have such a bigger insight into this clubhouse than most because you can speak the language of some pretty big stars that are walking around in Dodgers uniforms. You recently wrote a really interesting article about Roki Sasaki, and it seems like, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, of course, it seems like there seems to be some sort of lack of communication in terms of Roki's assessment of, kind of finding some things that he needed to work on with his pitches versus what the Dodgers coaching staff was saying. So if you could explain a little bit more about that piece and kind of where they sit with it.
Yeah. So, basically just kind of stemmed out of a conversation I had with Dave Roberts in the offseason where he just said, the guy needs a third pitch, right? It's obviously he's got the fastball. He's got the forkball that he throws. That's really kind of like a magical pitch. And, when he was in Japan, that was good enough for him to, at least when he was healthy, to be the best pitcher in the league over there. And so now it's obviously a little bit different. And he's right. The fastball probably doesn't play up as much as it did in Japan. And so, they're talking about, okay, well, he kind of has to add something. Now, my kind of view of this has kind of been the fact that, just again, maybe it's kind of an arm slot issue, right? And I've talked to scouts that are kind of questioning whether he can actually throw a slider, right? And I think he himself said that he thought that he was, that he had problems in Japan with his shoulder because he started throwing that slider. So I think that there are some questions here in terms of, okay, can he do it or not? Roberts seems to believe he can do this, and that what this really kind of comes down to is kind of his openness to things, right? One thing I thought that was very, noticeable in the clubhouse last year was the fact that, when you see guys kind of walking around, coming out of the shower with their shirts off and stuff. Most professional athletes, their bodies are built like, they look like people who spent their entire bodies, or their entire lives sculpting their bodies. Sasaki still kind of has like the body of a kid, right? And so, you do kind of wonder again, right, how much kind of work is kind of going on behind the scenes and stuff. Now he showed up to FanFest and said that he has been, lifting weights and stuff like that. But, I think that there is this kind of question of how much of this inability to develop a third pitch is about kind of intent, and how much of it is just like, okay, maybe he just kind of can't do it, in which case, maybe long term he profiles better as a closer, right? I mean, I think, but again, Roberts kind of says, hey, I think he can do it, and that it really this kind of comes down to kind of how open he is. I thought what was really kind of interesting last year, obviously, I think, because it's right, and let's be honest, right, front offices, they're to some degree PR conscious, and this organization right now has a reputation of like breaking pitchers, right? They've obviously kind of gone into this whole, right, they've bought into all the driveline stuff, and there's questions about how effective it is. So, when Sasaki kind of came back and, reestablished himself as a closer, obviously, I think the organization kind of wanted to celebrate this thing. And, they kind of, right, there were stories that came out about, Rob Hill and kind of the work that he did with Sasaki and stuff. The interesting thing is, when Sasaki kind of gets asked about it, he was just like, oh, no, it's just like watching like videos of myself in like my hotel room one day. He's never said Rob Hill's name. Like, he's kind of said like, oh yeah, at one point I met with somebody who was kind of like a pitching coach, in Arizona. We agreed on the ideas, but as far as like the solution for it, I was the one that kind of came up with it. Now, it is kind of important to establish here that this might not be necessarily like a Dodger issue, right? Because Sasaki's kind of had this reputation of being this very kind of staunch individual from the time he was in Japan, right? I don't think, look, it's not like I'm buddies with Ohtani by any means, right? He's obviously kind of his own little world. That said, like, for example, if I walk by, Ohtani, he'll usually like bow or something, right? We give each other like little bows, right? Just kind of little social formalities that kind of exist in Japanese culture. Sasaki's not great with that stuff, right? Now, I personally kind of excuse a lot of this stuff from the fact that his background is very different, right? Obviously, he survived a very traumatic tsunami that wiped out his entire hometown, lost his father with whom he was very close, and the fact that he spends as much time in that area, because usually guys that come from like rural communities will spend like the entire off season, like in Tokyo and stuff. Mm-hmm. This place is like really hard to get to, by the way. I went there, I guess it was last year. Yeah, I went there last year before they opened the series in Tokyo, and it took me like 7 hours to get there, right? I mean, because they're not even train lines that run there, because everything kind of got wiped out. And, he still orders the same every time he goes back to like his favorite restaurant, which is run by like his dad's very close friend, right? Mm-hmm. He orders the same dish every time. So again, I think he has, when I talked to the guy about it, like, why do you think he kind of comes back here? He says, this is probably like when he was like happiest, right? In terms of like, his dad was still alive. He had both grandparents. And so I'm willing to kind of look, like, okay, this guy's been through a lot. If he doesn't kind of fit the mold that every other baseball player in Japan does, like, well, like, let's kind of excuse that. The Japanese are a little less forgiving about that, right? So, they think he's rude and this and that. And it's kind of interesting because he's a very divisive figure in Japan, right? Yes, obviously Ohtani is their Michael Jordan. That said, you write something about Sasaki, he comes out on TV, it almost draws as many eyeballs just because of, again, how divisive of a figure he is over there.
Interesting.
Yeah, that was one of the things I was kind of wondering in reading your column there. is there sort of like a communication problem between the Dodgers and Sasaki? But it could just be that, I don't want to go as far as saying that he's stunted in his growth, but he's still young. He's still got a lot to learn, and hopefully, being with this organization, they could help, not only make him a great pitcher, but turn him into a great big leaguer, great teammate, and all that kind of stuff. I could think of somebody, Yasiel Puig, who had to learn a lot after entering the league. He was also a young pup entering baseball, coming from a different country, all that kind of stuff. So when you got a 100-mile-an-hour fastball on your right and that nasty forkball, you can give him the grace for sure. But I appreciate you sharing a little bit more there, because I thought that was a very interesting kind of look at Roki. Roki is definitely one of the big storylines at spring training. What else are you kind of keeping an eye on with this team that's primed to go for a three-peat?
Yeah, I think just the way camp in general is going to go, right? They obviously had the short off season. They had a short off season last year. Now you got the WBC here, and it's just kind of how do you kind of manage everybody, right? I mean, I think it's probably going to be more, because modern baseball, like we're used to seeing, right, guys train year round. They show up to spring training already in shape, right? This type, right? When you think about like spring training, like in the 1960s or whatever, these guys were working on their jobs. It was right, and spring training was actually to get into shape. And so obviously, it's not like these guys were just sitting around doing nothing the whole winter, but I do think that a lot of these guys needed to give their body some time to recuperate, especially, again, the fact that it's an older team. I'm guessing there are some guys that, probably started their things a little bit later than usual. And so, kind of, I guess, the way they're going to kind of build everybody up, and then obviously with, that really applies especially on the pitching side. In a way, I'm guessing the Dodgers were probably happy that, Ohtani is not going to pitch in the WBC. That said, they're going to have Yamamoto going, right? And it kind of sounds, from what I've heard, he looks great right now. He showed up early. He's been looking really good. And how much can he do, right? I mean, I think a lot of this, too, is now, you want to look at a key guy here is probably Osamu Yada, right? His personal trainer. And this is going to be kind of a test in a way, I guess, of Eastern training methods, right? Which are very kind of different than they are out here. We saw obviously Yamamoto do what he did in the World Series, and you kind of think like, well, you know what? Like there's probably not an American pitcher that could have done that. So maybe they're onto something, and maybe, even after doing all that last year, he can go to the WBC and be Japan's #1 pitcher and then still kind of come back and make 30 plus starts and win a Cy Young Award. To me, that's going to be kind of interesting too. Obviously, Blake Snell's already, kind of talked about some, issues he's having and about slow playing it, and last year, the one thing we saw too, though, is that I think, when you kind of look at the early, I don't know what we want to call them, Guggenheim Dodgers, obviously when Friedman first came in, they were really kind of prioritizing, quantity, I felt, over quality, right? I think this philosophy at the time was, okay, we need, just the playoffs are a crapshoot. Let's just get in as many times as possible, roll, right? Get as many rolls of the dice as we can, and we're eventually going to hit. But I think you kind of got pushed to a certain point, and then like you kind of start realizing like, well, maybe you kind of need stars, right, to really win. And I do think that we've seen, and part of it maybe was just opportunity. Maybe it was a slight change in philosophy, but we're seeing them build, right? They're going out and actually getting the top guy now, right? Whereas, they didn't really make a play for, Bryce Harper or whatever, Mookie becomes available. Okay, let's go get him, right? They jumped on Freddie Freeman. They get Ohtani. They're getting like the top of the top guys. And now, and Alana, you remember, right? There were platoons like up and down the lineup. Mm-hmm. The lineup changed drastically every day. Now they have like a pretty set team, right? And that you can kind of predict what's going to be out there every day. And I do think that's great, again, for the postseason. You look at the bullpens too, the way they're constructed, it's right. Everybody throws 100, and that's great. For 1 month, if you just tell everybody hey, just throw the crap out of the ball, that's going to work. Sustaining that over 6 months, I think, is kind of tough, right? And I went back not too long ago, and I was looking at Tanner Scott was fine for the first month and a half, right? It was just like he had pitched like in more than half the games at that point, and so now all of a sudden, right, in that kind of style, like maybe you just kind of get worn down, and so. I do think, and then like last year, we kind of saw, right, they went through a period where you're kind of like, oh my God, like, are they going to, right? Are they even going to win the division? Are they going to get caught? Now, once they get into the postseason, it's great, I think before they kind of had the opposite problem, right? Where it was like, okay, they're getting into the postseason for sure, but what's going to happen? Do they really have the big horses to get them over the line once they get there? So I guess, and that kind of folds into this whole idea about the ramp up is, while yes, they do have the luxury for the most part of being able to look ahead to October, they don't want to be too cute, right, in doing things, because there is a chance, right, you don't win 90 games, maybe, right, you end up in last year they had to play in that wild card round, which, again, it turned out to not be a problem, but it can turn into a problem. You run into the wrong pitchers. So I think just the way they kind of manage all of that, they got a lot going on right now in terms of that. Obviously, a lot of really good players that they kind of have to take care of. And, it's obviously kind of managing them individually while kind of keeping in mind the bigger picture.
最後までご覧いただきありがとうございました。今回の動画についてどういう感想を持たれましたか？ぜひコメント欄で意見や感想をお聞かせください。チャンネル登録やグッドボタンを押していただけると励みになります。それでは次回の動画でお会いしましょう。